hello and welcome to another Birds of a Feather episode. I'm joined here as always with my wonderful co-host, Aimee Byrd, but we have a group of other guests you may have already seen, met around before, Kristen, Beth and Devi. Everyone, welcome back. And I am honored to be able to talk to so many evangelical elites. I am but a humble clergyman. I'm just a former koala butcher from Warrnambool, and I don't understand these convoluted urban elite ways. I'm just a humble koala butcher from outback Australia. But all of you are very successful in what you do, in books and in media and that type of thing. So it's great for Aimee and I to talk to you and have you back. But interested in what's been happening with the various books that you've written and contributed to, and what's been going on in your sort of book world since your books have been released. I think we'll kick off with Aimee.
Hey. You want me to talk about what's been going on with my books?
Well, in terms of any more feedback or fallout or angry
golly.
mobs?
Well, so it's been over a year since Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood was published. It was June 2020 when it was published. And yeah, I mean, I would say, after we hear from the others, it's cost me a lot. The book has cost me a lot in terms of friendships, in terms of my church and my denomination. And just, I would say, it's interesting because the content of the book, I haven't had to do much deep thinking on and reconsidering. Actually, it's confirmed for me the importance of needing. I've had to really follow my title. I've had to do a lot of recovering, because it's actually caused a lot of trauma, a lot of personal trauma for me, what I've gone through with my denomination. So I would say, it's been a very personally wounding process for me, but I've also had many good responses and a lot of encouragement, which is wonderful. But it just really is a gut punch when it's, people who you go to for help or who you look to for shepherding, church officers in your denomination who didn't so much say, we don't like her book and we have issue with, some critique points, but have really come after me in some pretty awful ways. So I've learned some really good things from that, though, I will say. I mean, it's made me have to look at, what matters. Even asking questions like, my reputation, does that matter? I had to give that to God, really, in a lot of ways and say, Jesus, you're better. I care less about what people think of me in a good way, I think. I want to be more empathetic to others and listen to voices that are outside of my, inner circles more. I think that's a good thing. I've really learned that we can have the word of Christ and miss Christ himself, because being in the Reformed tradition, I think, we have these, what we think of as gifts in our liturgy and our government and in our confessions. But what I've found is that those can all be very hollow and empty if, without Christ himself and without love. I've learned that we don't have all the answers. So I think it's been a very good humbling process for me. And I've learned that the best stuff sometimes can't be taught didactically. So, I think those things are taking me now into my next book that's launching in March, which is called The Sexual Reformation, Restoring the Dignity and Personhood of Man and Woman. And I'm really excited about it. I'm a little gun shy to release another book, to the wolves in some sense, but right. I'm really excited with what I've learned and really feeling like I have been met by Christ through this and have really grasped tight of what matters.
Amazing. Excellent. Thank you, Aimee.
Yep.
Kristen, I know your book continues to go from strength to strength. I don't know whether you're rivaling Michelle Obama on the New York Times bestseller list. But,
I'm not.
But surely you must be getting there. You must be getting there. Yeah.
No, I mean, the life of the book is, I mean, first I'll say it hasn't been personally traumatic in the same way, I think for a few different reasons. I'm not situated in the same kind of space that Aimee is, I think, denominationally. And my book, too, was not a book that was crafted exclusively to appeal to an evangelical audience or even a Christian audience. It has different audiences, academics, and then just the general public, and also evangelicals. And so I've always had, I think, a more diverse readership, and then more diverse sense or directions of affirmation. And the book has done really well it's holding up really well in academic spaces, which for me as an academic, that's my primary identity. That's, means a lot to me. And so it was really the evangelical response that was quite positive compared to what I had anticipated, right? My expectations were quite low. That has just been really affirming to me. I think that for me, the last months have been just exhausting. And I not to complain, because it's, you write a book, and I've written books that are not widely read. And so I don't take for granted when a book is, you write words and you care about and you think they're important. And so when they're read, that it really is amazing. And when they reach readers who most need them, it's been really incredible. What I hadn't been prepared for was how this wasn't just my book I was putting out in the world, it was also me. And so I had no idea how many interviews I would be doing now, more than a year out, still sometimes several a day, or journalists calling, and lots of media, and all good, and also really, really exhausting. But it's certainly less traumatic and less personally traumatic, just requiring a new way to balance things. And I haven't quite achieved that yet.
Okay, well, that's I suppose good to hear. So different levels or different types of stress going on. Yeah, certainly sounds, Aimee, that thus far you've had the worst share of it, in terms of the I don't know, any websites dedicated to Kristen calling you?
Don't give anybody any ideas, please.
I don't know. We need to develop what I will call a unit of measure. I will call the jezebel-o-meter. That we go by the number of times you've been called a Jezebel determines how badly you've been treated by the patriarchy. I don't know. Maybe that could become a thing. We'll call it the jezebel-o-meter. I don't know.
I can see the trolls getting some ideas. Right?
Yes, I know.
Yeah,
I was thinking that
win.
too.
Aimee will win, hands down.
But then it becomes a contest as who can get the highest rating on the jezebel-o-meter. Right. It's kind of like if I just do a few more tweets, I can get. I mean, Aimee's an 18.4, and it only goes up to 10. But maybe I could catch her. Maybe I could catch Aimee. I don't know.
Yeah.
What about you, Beth? How's the jezebel-o-meter treating you?
I'm not as brave as Aimee, I don't think. I haven't quite gone toe to toe with as many folk. But, I also think that what's happened to Aimee shows a little bit of, in some ways, I don't, Kristen and I both have, in some ways, I think our PhDs and us being situated in universities that support us, give us some protection that, we're not quite as vulnerable, whereas Aimee was doing this on her own and speaking into, she didn't have the academic umbrella, standing behind her, the support structure. And so when her church turned against her, there wasn't a structure standing behind her. So for me, even at the worst of it, when Kevin DeYoung wrote that really awful thing about me, it was only a small part of my world. It wasn't, my academic world was, in fact, half of the academics, they hadn't even read it. They didn't know anything about it. They didn't really care about it. In fact, I sent it to this one, to a very trusted advisor of mine. And she, very well-known women's historian. And she said, do you even have to care about this person? And I was like, that's such a refreshing sort of, because, you
Yeah.
know, in some sense, I didn't have to, in some part of, you know, in that my academic identity. And even where my husband is now at our church, and we had been through a very traumatic experience that was similar, you know, to what
Yeah.
Aimee just went through. And so, I mean, I felt I was reliving some of that while watching Aimee go through it. It was just so awful, because I remember that. But at the same time, you know, my husband is no longer in that space. And so while we are still, you know, I think, you know, it's interesting being in Waco right now, because Waco is a pretty conservative space, especially for women's roles. I mean, I seriously can count on my hands the number of churches that have women in ministerial positions that allow them to have authority over men. And the response of churches in this area is interesting to me. I did have a local pastor write a review, you know, essentially warning everyone against my book and going on. And he was upset about the "In Christian Patriarchy" stickers. He thought they were disrespectful, which I thought was kind of funny.
My son's got one on his guitar.
Yeah, well, I thought it was kind of funny. And so I was able to write a response. It wasn't directed at him, but my local newspaper asked me to write an editorial response to some of that.
Wow.
So I sort of wrote a broad kind of, I didn't target this pastor. He's a pretty young pastor. And, you know, it's hard when you've been trained in these things and this is all you know. I don't really blame him, but it has been interesting because I think I'm thinking about doing some more within my hometown where I am, to try to raise awareness about this within churches. And so, you know, that could be kind of interesting. We'll see what happens. But at the same time, as I said, I don't really have as much to lose. I mean, everyone at Baylor is very supportive of what I'm doing. I have, you know, my family's very supportive. We did lose a lot of friends, as Aimee talks about, but it's, you know, it's been a little while since then. And while we're not completely, you know, I still feel those holes, but it's not a new thing. It's something we've been living with for a while. And at the end of the day, the response from the women all over the world is just really, you know, it keeps one going. I mean, every once in a while I'll send one of the messages or something to Kristen and, you know, and some other people and be like, this makes it worth it when you get these messages from people just all over the world. And that's what's been amazing about the Making of Biblical Womanhood right now, is that global reach. I mean, I've been that, it jumped up tremendously in the rankings when essentially the Christianity Today of the UK came out with a very positive review of it, which really surprised me. And so now I'm getting speaking invitations from the UK, which is great. I'm going to be at Salisbury Cathedral in April. Yeah, I'm really excited about. It's going to coincide with a research trip that I was planning anyway. And then I was interviewed by the German NPR, National Public Radio, last week, and that was really, you know, fantastic. And then the book has already been sold to be translated into Korean. And there's also talk. So, I mean, I'm really
Korean. That's interesting.
Yeah, I know. So the global reach of it, and I have a graduate student. Well, she was a graduate student at Baylor, but she was also connected to some in China, and she wrote a review that essentially ended up like in the, you know, the not quite the New York Times. I don't know, the Shanghai Book Review. It ended up in the Shanghai Book Review of the Making of Biblical Womanhood, and she sent it to me because it overwhelmed her by how many hits it got and how many people were reaching out to her about it. So I've been, you know, I'm just like, and, you know, one of my graduate students, I did have this Twitter exchange about Denny Burk's article that we're going to talk about in a minute, where he put out there, he sort of told me what it was about because I said I didn't really want to read it. And he said, you know, it's complementarianism pretending like they're this beleaguered institution, you know, that everybody's against them. And I said, oh, well, hopefully my book is contributing to that. You know, that's really going to make it be a little bit beleaguered. And so I feel hopeful that I'm having an impact, which does make it worth it, even though it hasn't always been fun.
Okay.
So
well, would you ever have thought you had been doing a Zoom interview with some people in Australia talking about your respective books? And more importantly, When are you going to visit Australia? It's just one short 18-hour flight.
No,
I was going to go there this summer, and then COVID delayed it. So I do hope to get out there.
Well, if you got to come out, because as Debbie will tell you, this is the land where the kangaroo roams free and the Vegemite is always fresh. So,
and some other things too. Like
we have some
really great things.
Yes.
Along with the Vegemite, that's always fresh.
Vegemite.
Yeah.
I mean, if you like coffee, Melbourne is a place to come, I guess, but I don't know anything about that. You'll have to ask.
You would
Coffee
know.
shortages worldwide. I don't know about that, but there's lots of other great things.
I'm not saying it was
Peaches.
I'm not saying it was me about the coffee shortage, but I'm very happy about it. But there we are. Well, Debbie, do you have any questions for our esteemed guests?
I do. We're about to talk about the idea of this evangelical elite, whatnot. And so I'm really curious if there's a historical context for evangelicalism and evangelicals thinking that there's certain elite groups within evangelicalism. So I was wondering, Kristen, if you have any insight into that, in particular, I guess the last 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That's a really good question. I don't think the categories have quite meant the same thing as they do now. But I think within evangelicalism, I mean, going back more than 100 years, this revivalist tradition, this kind of anti-institutional, that's just part of the movement's identity. And then, you throw in the Holy Spirit and who knows what's going to happen and who that Spirit's going to empower. And so there's always been a kind of populist element within evangelicalism that is not necessarily a bad thing. And that power functions in different ways. That said, through the 20th century, particularly in the post-war era, where you do see this rise of this kind of quest for respectability, once again, within evangelicalism, and quest for greater social power. And really with Billy Graham at the center, you have this kind of celebrity and a new sense of authority and a new kind of pride in the figures who can wield power, the figures who are deemed respectable. And so that's also been a strand. And then you could kind of trace it, kind of the tensions there up to the present. But right now we're in a weird moment where there's this very kind of resurgent populist and anti-intellectual strand of evangelicalism. And then you've got the celebrity culture within evangelicalism. And then you've got the kind of intellectual elite, and those the celebrities can go both ways. The celebrities can go the populist direction or the intellectual elite tradition. And so you've got a lot of tensions, I think, just throughout. So as soon as we start talking elite, we really have to dig in. What constitutes an elite? Are we talking about education? Are we talking about socioeconomic status? Are we talking about influence? What are we talking about? And right now, I tend to use the word more to being either education and or socioeconomic status in a descriptive way. In many more populist or just conservative spaces today, it has become a pejorative term. And so it's somebody who's currying favor, it's somebody who's insincere, and it's really not a genuine Christian. And so again, as I use it, like, sure, I could be an elite because I have a PhD. Socioeconomically, not so much, when we talk about that, but that's not really, how it's being used in conservative discourse. It's really a pejorative term that is supposed to discredit somebody.
Yeah, I would have, sorry, I was going to say, I would have thought that the way Denny Burk used it, and Denny's a friend of mine, so I think I know what he means. I think he means people who occupy institutions and platforms that give them influence. And I think what Denny thinks that people in these places are trying to mediate secular, non-Christian culture into evangelicalism, partly so they'll be accepted by the wider secular culture. I think it's something along those lines. But yeah, there was a movie that was meant to come out in 2016 about a group of high-flying elites who take some ordinary people captive and then release them into this area and then try to hunt them. And I think that I think is the sort of elite-ophobia, if you want to call it, that is sort of that the elites are really literally out to hunt us down. But I think they canceled the movie when Trump got elected or something like that, because it was no longer, because they worried it was going to feed into that. But
I was in. Oh, go on. I was in an interesting conference, actually, the Evangelical Studies Society conference last week, that I ended up chairing a whole morning on. And one of the most interesting papers I heard was talking about this evangelical association with victim identity, the self-identification as victims, and the evolution of this within the 20th century, but really picking up in sort of the last part of the 20th century. And part of this, and this professor was associating it with the voice of the martyrs, and thinking about, this rise of persecution literature. But not only that, we are praying for people who are persecuted around the world, but that we actually see ourselves as being these people, and what happens to them can happen to us. So when I was skimming, I'll be honest, when I was skimming Denny's article, I was thinking about that self-identification as victims. And that did seem to come out, because you also see this very defensive voice within it, essentially trying to defend about how big they actually are, that they're not a small, narrow little group, but at the same time, there's still this sense that they are the minority that is being persecuted by this much, secular. So I thought that was interesting, thinking about that part of this too, this identification of the elite is also the self-identification as being the victim.
Which is ironic, given, doesn't he have a PhD and he's an academic in an academic institution? Am I making that up?
Well,
he's the president of a major.
Yeah,
I
so
think
it's interesting how some academics are elite, but some are not.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, and he's actually picking up on the language that Mark Galli used in his article, which was, pretty much pointing the finger at Christianity today as the elite, which I found to be, I had read that article.
Yes.
And the reason why I read that one is because it was like all over Twitter, everyone's using the word elite all of a sudden. Like, what is the source of this? And then I realized it was this Mark Galli article. So, I find it interesting that, there's this pointing these fingers and the motives behind it too, which would be to like get in good with the secular world. And I think that Denny Burk just kind of really, he does kind of like to label people in his critiques. So, he called this a jaw-dropping column of Mark Galli's, which I found an interesting way to describe it. I didn't find it very jaw-dropping. When I was reading it, I was just like, I don't know. I didn't understand why.
Aimee, could you recap what Mark said, particularly about the attitude towards complementarians allegedly at CT?
Okay, so he was saying more, it was kind of showing that there's this liberal drift that's been going on. And I found it interesting that he talked so poorly about them, having worked for them for quite a while. So, he led them. So I find that very interesting that here he was like the editor-in-chief, and now he's kind of throwing them all under the bus. I just thought, wow, what if I had done that about, the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals after I moved on, it's just very interesting. But so he's kind of identifying what he, calls this liberal drift. They're caring too much about, getting columns on, the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so that they are compromising evangelical kind of the constructed value system. Some of it is like complementarianism, but also, then it's this fear factor, like of the liberal drift, which Denny Burk really picked up on. And then he seemed to kind of bolster the case by saying, yes, they didn't cover the Nashville statement in a positive light or enough. And it became all about their accomplishments at CBMW and the Nashville statement. And therefore, if you don't cover the national statement, then you must really be on this liberal drift. And so that they're kind of identifying Christianity today as moving away from the tenets of evangelicalism, and now we need new leaders.
But what was really striking to me with both the Galley and the Burk piece was the insinuations about motive here. And
Yes.
right, and for both, there's a need to name names, right? Because it's a relatively small group that we all know who they're talking about, or at least we can name several. So who is writing regularly in the New York Times right now? That's Tish Warren, and that is Esau McCauley. And then other folks, you know, regularly. So Karen Swallow Pryor might be on that list. And then you've got David French, who was named. And, you know, it's a fairly small list. And then there's some of us who write on occasion, but not regularly. But so to me, that was really quite shocking. The insinuations that were being leveled against these Christian writers, that they were crafting their words in order to curry favor with some kind of nameless elites. Now, you could ask instead, why does the New York Times seek these evangelical voices? That would have been a legitimate question, but that's not what Galley was saying here. And that didn't seem to be what Burk was amplifying either. It really was suggesting that these are cynical people who are selling out evangelicalism for some honor and glory to have your name appear in the Times, which honestly at a certain point made me wonder, you know, where is this? It feels like there's some resentment or even jealousy maybe coming through. I don't know, but it felt, the whole piece felt off to me, because I know who he's talking about and I know these people, and whether I agree with them or not on any particular issue, I do not get the sense at all that they are writing to please other people at all. So that I found really quite shocking.
Yeah, I mean, I know Esau a bit through the Biblical Studies sort of guild, and he's a wonderful guy. He's a wonderful guy. He's great, and you know, he's got a great book on, you know, and Christianity and the Black Church, and I found that very informative as someone who lives, you know, far away from that context. I found it very informative, and I think he was sought out by the New York Times precisely because he's a person who is doing a good job in his own space, and he would be a great person to speak into the wider culture. I don't think the New York Times was thinking, you know, Esau McCauley will be our conduit to spread our secular values into not only African American churches, but to finally colonize the white evangelicals at last.
No, yeah, I
don't think they're that clever. Yeah.
No,
or
but you know what? I was thinking while I was reading both of those pieces that I know a lot more about anti-Catholic strains within early Protestant Christianity than I do about some of this that's going on in modern evangelicalism. But it read to me very similar to some of the conversations that we see in Protestant churches, especially in the 19th century, in which we have these anti-Catholic, very anti-Catholic strains, in which they are imputing these types of motives, that there are these, secret Catholics within your church that are going to come and start trying to spread this, that's going to take you away from the true faith. And that seems to be this attitude. And what I found was interesting about Mark Galli and Denny Burk is that they are both making a similar argument, but they're attacking, Mark Galli is attacking the people at CT, who I actually, his article really explained a lot of things to me about, because I still see CT as, I don't think the liberal drift has hit it the way that Mark Galli seems to think it has. But nonetheless, but Mark Galli is sort of pointing fingers and attacking the people who are bringing in this liberal drift. And then Denny Burk attacks Mark Galli for being the one, sort of bringing it. So it creates not only this persecution, but then this attacking one another within and identifying an enemy. It's this whole, we have to have an enemy in order, evangelicals define themselves by having an enemy to fight. So was my takeaway from looking at them.
We have to have an enemy, but I also think, and I really do think Denny had the question that kind of summarizes everything, which is, it's a jostle for power. Who is going to lead us? That's what it also seems to be about.
Yeah.
In the sense of, okay, Billy Graham's gone. Can we have a broad coalition of evangelicals? And I think the Mark Galli suggestion that it's Doug Wilson rankled a little bit for other conservatives.
Well,
I don't
and
think
also
they
the
loved it either.
He's just misunderstood. He's just
Yeah.
misunderstood.
No,
He
but
is syncretic.
really,
That's the only problem. He's just so idiosyncratic.
Yeah, that's it.
right.
Oh
So,
dear. Well,
yeah,
I mean,
I guess I was wondering if you do think there is a jostle for power, like who's coming out and leading the race?
Aimee
well,
Byrd.
yes.
Oh, I'm the one who's leading all the power.
No, there absolutely is right now, right? So that is accurate. But I think how Denny characterized things too about around the Nashville statement is revealing. That he says that's this last moment of unity, right?
Oh, what a claim! What a claim!
Right.
Fascinating.
But of course, that's not. There are a lot of evangelicals, some of whom in this group right here, right, who would say, actually, I dissent from that. Then what we're seeing here is not movement from unity to division, not at all. What we're seeing is a realignment, a different sorting out, so that people like Russell Moore, who yes could sign that statement, people who maybe thought patriarchy was linked to orthodoxy. I think there's been a lot of people who are rethinking that now, and they might not give up their vision of complementarianism, but I think they're a lot more cautious about linking complementarianism with gospel truth.
Yes.
And as a requirement for Christian orthodoxy. And so that's the sorting out. And instead they're seeing, okay, Christian nationalism, white supremacy. There are other things that are destroying gospel truth. And so the sorting out is happening in different ways. Who will lead? It is not at all clear, because right now, not only are the old leaders confronting these new fractures, but we're also in the age of social media. And so a lot of these leaders can't get away with what they had been getting away with for a very long time. And you can see that happening in the SBC as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think fragmentation, there's always been a degree of fragmentation. But what I find weird now, I think the word evangelical is an adjective, but now it needs its own adjective. You need an adjective.
I read that, what you wrote.
And that's what I find the weirdest thing. And I think you've got a division between what I would say the more political evangelicals, who are the kind of, God in the image of Ronald Reagan, his chosen Messiah, Donald Trump, and I'm vaguely Protestant. So you get that kind of evangelical. Then you've got like the more culturally conservative, which is based on what I would call a post-World War II suburban culture. And it's kind of, domestic arrangements and that type of conservatism. And then you've got the more missional aspects, people who are maybe a bit more flexible in their form and mode of church, but kind of have a kind of theological core. And then you've got all the global variation. I mean, one thing that upsets me is everyone treats evangelicalism if it's something just happens in America, without understanding both the American imports and the own indigenous versions of evangelicalism. And if you've ever been to the UK, you'll know that British evangelicalism, and I think Australian evangelicalism, has a different vibe to American evangelicalism. That's my little 2 cents. And but I definitely think the evangelicalism is becoming an increasingly nebulous term. That's my thought.
I just feel like it's got, with this whole power grab, it's got our focus off of the main thing. Like we're not even. Why do we need an evangelical leader in the first place? Like we have our churches. And so it's like, are we being led by the parachurch? Like, I think that's a big question right now. And I think, what is the function of the parachurch? I know it's helped me in many ways. And, so I don't want to say parachurch is awful, but it's the church who's been called to disciple. So I just find that really interesting that we're looking for leaders outside of the church for this kind of discipleship. And it's not like God's going to be asking us, before we get into heaven, like, were you an evangelical or not? That's really that's not even part of any of this.
Thinking about like the Gospel Coalition and the CBMW as parachurch, that's actually pretty fascinating. I mean, I sort of thought that Denny's maybe response and why he pushed up, the CBMW and all the great things that it has done is because he was reacting to the TGC being also named, that Mark Galley said,
it's a
that,
for
he has
CBMW.
this weird thing about Doug Wilson, but then he says if he could name a next leader, it's probably going to be the TGC, which I was like, really? Anyway, but I could see how then, essentially, I think what Denny Burk was arguing was that the CBMW laid the foundation for the TGC, which is probably, they're connected. But anyway, but it is interesting thinking about these as parachurch organizations, and that a parachurch organization might even be considered to be a next leader for, I don't know. Right. That is very fascinating.
Well, I mean, one question you could say, we don't really have a figure like, I would say, like a John Stott figure, who was a global, who was Anglican, but who was a sort of a global evangelical leader who had a wide appeal and could, talk to Southern Baptists, could talk to Catholics, could talk to Anglicans, to Lutherans, and sort of inhabited his own global. I don't know of anyone who is similar to that today. Probably because I think we are so, despite the fact that we're now so connected on social media and different things, but that's led to more of the discrete tribalization that's been going on. And I guess for some tribes, what is the kind of nerve network for them is in some cases sort of Calvinism and Complementarianism is the sort of, the two legs propping up their evangelical tribe as it goes. But I was going to say, maybe we should move and change topics from Denny Burk and Mark Galley about evangelical elites to David Gushee's article about a number of books. And Gushee argues that there is I think maybe the word would be a realignment there is going on. Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing a lot of things happening. I mean, there's a big, I'm going to call it fad or phase into the sort of deconstruction. And part of that is people becoming evangelical. And that can be ranging from, departing from the faith altogether or just leaving church, but also being a Christian, but no longer wanting to be an evangelical Christian because it's just too loaded, too much baggage, too pejorative. And they see some of the, as the kids say, some of the totes cray-cray that goes on in those circles. Actually, I don't know whether the kids say that anymore. That's probably what they said. That's what they said probably 10 years ago, but I don't know anymore. But people doing that, and Gushee was talking about a number of books that had come out and that he thinks indicates this, including some books by people in the present company. So, any thoughts on David Gushee's article?
Well, I'm just glad that we're counted as young still, Beth. So that was my main takeaway here. But beyond that, it's a short piece, and he just really just kind of acknowledging this moment and also, bringing a couple of other, bringing his own work into this conversation, his own After Evangelicalism is a book that I have pointed several people to who are kind of struggling with the what next question, walking away from something, but not walking away from Christianity. And it's a really helpful resource for people at that point in their journey. But what really caught my attention was this book that he mentioned from a student of his that I had not heard of until I read this piece. And it's by Jacob Allen Cook, and it's called Worldview Theory, Whiteness, and the Future of Evangelical Faith. And that completely caught my eye because that is my story. That is my history. And so he, in Gushee's description, Cook deconstructs what he calls worldviewism through compelling case studies of some legendary figures in evangelicalism, including Dutch Christian leader Abraham Kuyper. So my dad wrote his dissertation on Abraham Kuyper. That's like my tradition through and through. Yeah. And Ockenga and others. And he shows, and here's the takeaway quote that I put on Twitter, and so did Beth, not connected. We just both pulled this out. It shows how what white evangelicals have labeled the Christian worldview bears a striking resemblance to whiteness. That is, white-centered and white hegemonic ways of viewing and arranging the world and responding to human difference. In other words, all those worldview conferences and seminars really may have been about teaching us how to think like white people, not like Christian people.
That's a big claim. Can I attempt to imagine how someone's going to respond to this? Like you diss an Abraham Kuyper, the Abraham Kuyper, that'll be the number one thing. who's kind of the one who brought us closest to a Christian theocracy as we'll ever have on earth.
Yeah.
Secondly, I can imagine someone saying that every topic is now being viewed through a racial lens. And you're taking sort of what is meant to be an area of theological study of worldviews, and you're trying to impose or view it exclusively through a racial lens. If someone was to say something like that, what would be an intelligent or a proper response?
Yeah, so some people are saying things quite like that on Twitter, right? First I would say it's not a stretch to bring a lens of racial analysis to Abraham Kuyper. It's not a stretch at all. And you can, get some folks from South Africa to weigh in on this as well, and how his system really supported apartheid for generations. So this is not imposing something onto these ideologies. More, I would say, for somebody who identifies with this tradition, who is deeply formed by Reformed worldview thinking, I responded to this book initially with, wow, this is for me, right? This is the book that I need to read. And it doesn't mean I'm going to throw out that intellectual and spiritual formation. It just means that I can perhaps craft my imagination and my theological understanding in a way that might be even slightly more obedient to the scriptures and to God's truth. Just understanding that this is how the world works, this is how the church works, and that no theological construct is perfect. And that all theology is a human product, and humans are always contextualized, and they are contextualized historically and culturally, and what they see and what they can't see is shaped by their racial identities. It's shaped by many different things, and that's not scary. That is just how the world works. And I've actually been influenced by missiologist Andrew Walls, who passed away just recently, in his thinking of Christianity and culture, and by the work of Leslie Newbigin, right? Both from coming within the tradition and showing just how much culture influences Christianity. But when you're in a dominant position, so white American Christianity or white Western Christianity, when you look at the 19th century mission field, that's usually invisible to the folks in power, whereas it's really easy to see the syncretism in the cultures that they encounter. So to me, there's nothing threatening here. This is just insight that could lead all of us, particularly those of us formed in this tradition, towards greater faithfulness.
Yes, I mean, I think that's one of the things that history really brings to this conversation, is that it helps us understand how our theology is always, how we think about God is influenced by who we are, by all the different parts of who we are. And so, I'm teaching a women's history and theory course right now. And this week we're talking about intersectionality, which I think is a really scary word to a lot of people, but it's a really, it's totally a no-brainer concept, that the way we approach pretty much everything in life is influenced by who we are, by our ethnicity, by our gender, by our, class, by race, class, and gender. These are things historians have known forever, that they influence the way we think and approach topics. And this is the same with theology. And so the problem is that people who are at the top, the people who have been creating and shaping a theology. And David Gushee called out, he said, look, this is a theology, a historical construct that has been shaped by a certain type of people for a long time. And now some other people are coming in and saying, let's look at it differently. And what we see is that it is not exactly what we thought it was. And that is, that's essentially what's going on right now. And some people are threatened by that. They only want to look at it from their own perspective and not from the perspective of other people. So.
Yeah, not only are they saying, let's look at this from a different perspective. But I mean, so many are so disillusioned by the church because they have been harmed by that system, because, we don't inadvertently have built systems that harm the vulnerable. And so, I mean, I think that it's hard to look at ourselves and do self-examination, especially like with traditions that we hold dear, and say that we've been hurting people. Yes. And I think that's very important right now. And that was one thing I really got out of his article and reading it through, and the books, that you all contributed that he mentions. He ends it, like he talks about how evangelicalism is losing credibility because of this disillusionment in the church, this, abuse that's going on in the church, and says that subculture is crashing all around us. And it just really made me think, like, what is it that's been holding evangelicalism together? I mean, I think that's really what he's getting at the heart of here. And his last line I found to be striking. He says, while their scholars do their surgeries, the people seek life, meaning, and Jesus somewhere after evangelicalism, which is what his book is called. But I mean, as an informed layperson, I really identified with that too, because I think that scholarship is so important, and academia is so important, but there has to be this collaboration, reciprocity, and communication. Like, the whole point of academia is not so they can be elite and talk to themselves, right? And same with pastors, but it's for the people, it's to serve the people. And we have to also be listening to the people because they have gifts to give as well. And so I think that, I don't know if, moving after evangelicalism is, the direction things are going to go in, but I understand why people are quote unquote deconstructing in a lot of different ways. I wouldn't use that term for myself, but I've had to do a lot of re-examining and relearning. And I think that's what so many are calling for, is to say, let's take our theology and let's look at it, from the marginalized side, and does it still teach the same thing, or how is it, is everybody experiencing Christ's love the same? And there is this whole power dynamic. So how can we look at all of that and hold fast to Christ and what matters, which is truth, goodness, and beauty?
Yes.
Like, we need to ask, where do we go from here? Which would make a great name. Which would make a great name for a podcast, Debbie. Do you think? Like, when people want to think through a specific issue,
maybe,
like Christian sexual ethics in a post-purity culture. I think this may have legs, Debbie. This may have legs.
Something. Yeah. I'll file it away.
Indeed. Well, Debbie, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, because you've lived in America, you've lived in Australia, you've lived in Europe, so you have a lot more global experience than the average Christian does, and you've seen Christianity in different contexts around the world. So, what are your thoughts? I mean, is too much of our church culture racially, maybe not racially centered, but racially myopic? We just live in our own little ethnocentric world, but we don't even know it. That's the problem. We just assume that the way I do Christianity is the same way they do it from Sweden to South Africa to Somalia, or even remote places like Melbourne.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd say definitely yes. As a missionary kid who grew up in the Philippines, who had brown parents who were heavily influenced by American thinking. So the answer is yes. But I think what I would say when I think about younger people in particular, the power centers have really shifted. So I don't know how many young complementarians even have heard of CBMW and Denny Burk. I don't know how many progressives, have either. And I think that's because the people they're listening to are tribal leaders, maybe that's the wrong word, hive leaders on Instagram, on Twitter, on TikTok, people who can gather a crowd, and their crowds are often much larger than what these official institutions have. So for me, that's really the shift that I notice, is that when evangelicals want to deconstruct now, whatever that looks like, if it's re-examine, deconstruct, decolonize, the variety of things that it can be, they've got people they can go to who are essentially a form of a parachurch organization who create religious experiences. I think the New York Times had a great article by a woman I don't remember about Glennon Doyle, and Glennon Doyle reach being religious in its nature, even though it's not sort of explicitly religious, but that people want this experience because of the transcendence, the religious fervor, that kind of thing. So I would say, I really think the official organizations of evangelicals in the United States, they are on their way to losing power. I don't think there's going to be a leader that comes out of it, because I think social media has truly become the leader, and everyone's got their person. Because the thing that social media gives, and maybe this is more for women than it is for men, is you can get insight into everyday life. So you can ask your favorite person, like, what do you eat for breakfast? What is your morning routine? And maybe that is going to make an impact on your life. So very different from before, whereas you just buy John Piper's book, Desiring God, you read it, it's supposed to change your life. You can have these people on Access. They could be your personal coach for $700 a month. They can actually coach you to have the life that they have. So it's just, I think social media has really changed the nature of power for ideas in general.
Do you have any more tips?
This is why we so need local church communities embodied.
Yeah, well, after COVID, Devi and I haven't been to church for months. So we just get some YouTube videos to watch, which are great, and I don't begrudge them. That's great. We probably should come towards a close, but before we do, I've got one particular question for Beth. You talked about the conservative culture of Waco. Now, after visiting, I thought it was under the matriarchy of Joanna Gaines. I was under the impression she is the queen bee of that town, and nothing goes down without Joanna's permission. She's somewhere between a mafia don and a kind of oriental despot. You know, that was my impression. Am I wrong?
Well, you know, I mean, the Gaineses have done wonderful things for Waco. They certainly have had their own controversy with the church that they have been affiliated with, which is a very, very large church in Waco, and they've backed off a little bit. I haven't actually heard that much about their church affiliation for a while. I will tell you that the city of Waco went toe-to-toe with them at the very beginning of COVID, because they were going to have their spring at the silos when all of this kind of started happening, and they had everything reserved, and they weren't going to cancel it. And the city of Waco actually stepped in, and they pulled all of their permits for all of the streets that they had reserved and everything around it, so that they had to cancel the spring at the silos. So there, you know, I think everybody's gotten over that, and clearly Magnolia is still flourishing and doing a lot of wonderful things for Waco. So yes, they do hold a lot of power, but they also hold some of this more decentralized power, which I think Devi was getting at, which is really fascinating, Devi. You know, to think about social, I hadn't thought about social media replacing these power structures in the way that you put, which means that all of us maybe are in a dying elite part of Christianity, because social media is just going to take us over, and that's the end of us too.
Well, I'm disappointed. We went from being like in the presence of evangelical elites to like, no, we're not elite anymore. You're not elite anymore.
Exactly. Although we're pointless too.
Although I think I'll say that, right, in part, we've straddled that world, right? That's part of our story here, that as academics, we didn't stay in our academic spaces, right? I first started a few years ago posting some of my thoughts and academic insights on Facebook. That's how it started. And then I moved over to Twitter, and it was right. And then I know Beth has had this experience. Aimee, this might be yours as well too. Somewhat bewildering to understand how much of a kind of personal following develops. You know, we were really just, hey, here's a cool idea. You might be interested in this, you know, just throwing it out there. But then there is this kind of personal connection that forms virtually and then in community. And so it is a phenomenon that, you know, I don't know if it's if you can't beat them, join them kind of scenario, because I want to be sensitive to the fact that the medium does shape the message. But for me and Beth, at least, I think to have one foot solidly in the academic world and then another kind of out there in this space, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, it's a strange space to be, but I think that academics, informed lay people, authors, all these, we shouldn't necessarily abandon Instagram. And so to the influencers, I think there is something to be said for meeting people where they're at, right? And for bringing medieval women's history, people who would never think to check out a book from, an academic library, to package this in a way that is accessible to them, both in terms of the book itself, but also in terms of the interviews, the videos, and even I'm terrible at Instagram, but if I were good at Instagram, I'd be on there with no apology, right? I think that that's partly our story as well, is that we haven't just stayed in the traditional spaces.
Right. We didn't stay in our lane, and it's changed. It's changed our careers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's because social media does democratize accessibility, and it can democratize knowledge, for good and for ill, as we have learned. But the main thing I think we can take away is that for $700, any one of the people here are willing to mentor someone on social media.
Without a doubt.
Absolutely.
Easily do.
For $700 a month, Kristen, Beth, Debbie, or Aimee will be your mentor. Or if you go up to $1,000 premium level, you can get all four. And for $1,500, you can also get coffee brewed by Mike Byrd, which is really just going to be Vegemite and some hot water. But there we are. Well, this has been a wonderful event. It's always great to talk to you, wonderful women, about the matters of faith, gender, culture, evangelicalism. Does anyone have any final thoughts on what they think the future of evangelicalism is going to look like? That's what David Gushee, he was talking about, like everything is unraveling. Does anyone have a final thought on what they think the future of, I guess we're talking mainly of American evangelicalism, what do they think that's going to look like?
I think Debbie said it was TikTok.
I'm not even on TikTok, so that was just a guess.
Oh, dearie me. I don't know. Well, for people who are called false prophets, you definitely got a lack of prophecy going on here.
Well, I will say Christ's church will remain.
Yeah.
We have that promise.
Exactly.
That's what we can hold fast to.
Okay, I was holding off weighing in because everything I say is depressing, and it felt like we were ending on a hopeful note. But Aimee is right. One thing I say over and over again after I end my depressing talks is that the fate of Christianity does not rest on white evangelicalism and their faithfulness. So we can wish the best, we can hope for the best, we can work for the best, but just remember, white evangelicals themselves have so often told themselves that the fate of Christianity does in fact rest on their faithfulness. And the church is so much bigger than that, throughout all of time and in this time today. So yeah, just relax, we'll be fine.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who are moving to create beauty from all these broken pieces.
Yes.
Seeing that we put false expectations on people, and just trying to cultivate healthier forms of trust and build healthier friendships and be able to serve God in their communities. And I do think, there's going to be a lot of positive movement out of this too. And as we know, we can hold fast to the fact that Christ loves his church and his church will remain.
Faith endures despite people. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Aimee. That is a wonderful thought to end with. Thank you very much. Right. Okay, well, it's been great. Thank you for joining us.